First thing I'd like to do is summarize the last part of the landscape, sort of contemporary observations, would be that there's one really fascinating aspect that I've never seen any particular work done on that actually makes Hawaii distinctively different from the mainland. And this has to do with our sort of the power of neighborhoods, especially in older neighborhoods. You wouldn't see it in Kapolei, for example, because that's a classic subdivision. But in older neighborhoods, whether it be Kalihi, Kaimuki, even to a certain extent, Hawaii Kai. And that's the importance of the carport. Carports, and this is especially true in the outer islands, the other islands, carports are a real interesting part of local life in that carports very rarely serve as areas to store cars. With my Hanide family and also where I used to live in for example, on 17th in Kaimuki, all of the neighbors, we were six little houses in one lot, all the neighbors use the carport as social areas. So there would be park benches gotten acquired from who knows where, relatives on Maui. I don't know. We seem to all have Maui County park benches. I don't know. I'm sure it wasn't legal, but everyone's got them. There's generally some sort of a fridge or cooler plugged into power, but that's available outside. And it's very typical when people get home, or especially on the weekends, people will hang out at that bench or in the carport area. And the thing that's interesting about carports is it's radically different, at least in my view, than the mainland concept of backyard. Because in the mainland concept of backyards, you have the front yard, then that's your period of lawn that oftentimes no one's allowed to use, even the dog. And it's very much a groomed piece of real estate, oftentimes marked with a white picket fence or some other marker, various types of shrubbery. And it's supposed to be very pretty. So in much of the mainland, especially in sort of American subdivisions, the front yard is a statement, very much in a Calvinist way, a statement of success, hard work, etc., for people to admire as they go by. So it's almost an art piece, if you would. Backyards are where people socialize, and the interesting thing about backyards is they're very, very private. They're often almost invariably fenced. You can't see them from the street, so you don't know what's going on. And to me, that's a very mainland thing, especially because as we mentioned a number of times, and especially in the American subdivision, people have generally been in the subdivision for less than 7 years and they're not going to be there in 5 years. So you don't have a close relationship with neighbors because everyone's basically migratory. So what you want to do is whatever you do socially, you want it to be private. You don't want the neighbors who you don't know very well to suddenly invite themselves to the party, as it were. Um, Here in Hawaii, what you find is, especially in the older neighborhoods, that's not the case. The older neighborhoods, many folks have been there for, a minimum would be a decade, in many cases, maybe two, even maybe three generations in the same residence, and in many cases with many of the same neighbors around them. And so what you find is, this is true again when I was living on 17th, the folks had been there for generally about maybe 8 or 10 years, but they were all local, most of them were part Hawaiian. And everyone basically spent time on the benches and everyone was outside. And one of the key aspects would be as friends or neighbors or relatives would cruise by down 17th to see if someone was home. They wouldn't knock on the door or even use a phone. They would cruise by and see if someone was sitting, if some of the family were hanging out on the park bench in the carport, which was highly visible from the street. Then that meant that there was, they were open to socializing. And so what you got was a huge amount of interaction that almost invariably rotated around the park bench. Super Bowl Sundays, football games, baseball games. I mean, you name it. Everything was, and in large part still is, gravitates around the bench or seating in the carport, not in the interior of the house. Now, in some ways, when you think about it, this actually is almost like a modern spin, if it were in a partial way, of the traditional Hawaiian house, where the traditional Hawaiian house, the hale, was basically people had private, sort of sleeping residence inside of the house, but all the social activity occurred on the lanai. And I would argue that in many ways, the lanai is the carport in the 21st century and 20th, 21st century that moves to the carport. I don't think the front porch ever becomes a lanai here, in large part because in most of our houses, on the front porch, almost the minute that it's built, the house is built, that becomes enclosed for more interior space. But the interesting thing is what that also means, that puts even more pressure for then where the cars go. The cars go on the street because people are using the carport as a area of social entertainment in a very gregarious neighborhood way. And I think this makes Hawaii radically different than the mainland in almost any way that I can think of. For one thing, the popularity of carports here is actually quite high. It's not only that they're cheaper, but also they're serving a different function. They're not they're not garages in the sense of, private enclosed sort of high security areas for private use. You want to have a place where people can hang out and socialize and do stuff together. And you want the convenience of doing it at home versus packing everything up and going down to the beach or going to a park or something like that, which might be sort of the mainland version of that. And so, especially if you go to the other islands, I'm most familiar with Maui, but certainly even living back on Kauai, everyone had carports. And carports pretty much were one of the definers of local existence, and especially in upcountry Maui still now. If you go by places and you see carports, you know automatically that's probably a local family. And if when you're in that area and you're trying to find somebody and you're not sure what house they're at, and you see a carport with people hanging out, it's entirely acceptable to get out of your car, go down there, and sort of talk story for a minute and say, hey, da 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 da. And people almost be very open about talking to you because they're out in public, and that means that they're willing to socialize. If you see houses in upcountry Maui that have 2 and 3 car garages, then it's a pretty decent bet. It might not be right, but it's a pretty decent bet that those folks are part-time residents or from the mainland or some other place. So one of the interesting aspects that survived in some sort of a very modified form in the 20th and 21st century is the idea of neighborhood space, and the sense of part of the home is set up as a social space for neighbors and other folks who well, largely family, to basically interact. And this goes on till late at night. I mean, a fair number of folks spend a lot of their time, I would argue in many ways, probably more time socializing in the carport than they do inside of the house. And then, what this way I frequently see TVs, for example, you'll have either another TV or a TV that you can move in and out through a window so people can actually, watch the game or watch stuff in the carport. So unlike I think the mainland where my impression of carports would be is that's folks that are too poor to have a garage. Carports here originally were, obviously part of that. It was a covered space, but it wasn't enclosed space. It was cheaper. But I think, and also in many ways here, it's a very practical social use of space that, in some ways I would argue that the new neighborhoods in places like Kapolei and Evans, such like that, it would have been intriguing if that would have been what they had instead of garages. I think in some ways you'd end up with a different dynamic for the neighborhood if you were going to have persistent long-term neighbors. Again, if it's going to be like the mainland where people leave every 3 to 5 years for another place, then people wouldn't want carports because they don't give you enough privacy. So neighborhood and family socializing here in older neighborhoods, one of the things that you see frequently is privacy is not as valued a commodity in some ways as being able to have a social network. And this is because people, have long, 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 complicated relationships with neighbors and family here that are very important to them. So then segueing on to what I think the changes that have occurred. By the mid 20th century, especially with a huge growth of wealth here, both with tourists and also leisure resort types coming in, and then eventually hotels, and now of course with Hawaii becoming one of the premier destinations for people with a lot of money, both in the mainland but also from Asia, is the idea of residence as part of elitist architecture. And if you think about it, architects don't design subdivisions in Kapolei. There's probably an architectural firm that did the work, but they're not going to put their name to it particularly because it's a subdivision. It's a tract home. Architects design impressive pieces of architecture for people that have a lot of money, and whether it be public buildings, whether it be private sector buildings like say First Hawaiian Bank, or whether it be large homes in Port Lock or Black Point or Kahala or whatever. Elitist architecture is by definition intended to be different. So if you hire an architect, you don't want it to look like a tract home. You want it to be an enormously spectacular manifestation, one way, shape, or form, of the fact that you are upwardly successful. So if you would, it's like the 120% version of the Calvinist idea of a bigger home or more windows or white paint. Now, this also applies to interior design because you're not going to find folks in Kapolei using a lot of interior designers. They're going to go to, watch shows on Home and Garden TV or one of the other channels, and then they're going to go down to Inspiration or one of the other furniture places, or maybe online now, and basically get stuff. But they're not going to hire a professional in the interior design business for a tract home because, for two reasons. One is it wouldn't be a worthwhile investment. because the price of the home is still going to be largely based on the neighborhood. And secondly, if people are only going to be in there for a fairly limited time, why would you want to, invest $30,000 to $70,000 redoing the interior of a house when you're never going to recover that cost? And probably equally importantly, no one that goes by the neighborhood is going to think that it has that interior, so you're not going to be able to impress anyone with it. To a certain extent, interior design, while it might be in part, to fulfill the enjoyment of clients, much of interior design is just like exterior design. It's designed to impress people that are invited into a house or see the house. So it's a look what I've got. It's a form of very conspicuous consumption. A lot of interior design, especially here in upscale neighborhoods, is pretty, I'm trying to polite way to say it. It's pretty cost intensive. In many cases, I think if you go into upscale houses, I've been in a number here in Kahala, for example, you almost think that in some cases people wouldn't really mind it if somehow they could leave the price tag on the furniture and the other pieces, so people can be impressed with the relative cost of things. And you don't see it much here, but again, if you go to the mainland, it's still fairly common, according to my sister. I haven't been back in a while, for people to leave the sticker of the price of a car on the inside of a car when they buy it. So if you buy a new car, you don't take it. There's always that sticker on the inside which shows what the car cost. Rather than taking it out, people will leave it in there if they want people to be impressed with how much the cars cost. Because, just in case people don't know, you wanted to know this was actually a $60,000 car. So accidentally leaving the price tag on the inside is a real handy way to reinforce the fact that you can afford a $60,000 car. So elitist architecture and design is a huge part of what architects do. It's a huge part of what interior designers do. And it's always important to remember that because it's defined by a very peculiar clientele that have a whole mess of agendas, some of which they're not even particularly aware of, in making a place nice or making a place look fancy. That's very much going to be culturally driven, but it's also going to be driven by perceptions of clients in terms of what is wealth and how is wealth, reflected in basically in conspicuous consumption and in built objects and built environment. One of the other things that really becomes key with this then is also this idea that as we're shifting, especially in the last 20, 30 years here, and this isn't just a Hawaii thing, it's true in many urban areas, is the idea that you move from the idea of residence as home, the sense of residence as a place where people live, to residence as an investment. This has been, I think, one of the enormous changes in the last 30 or 40 years. And again, I don't think that, network TV and YouTube and all that have really driven this, but I do think they reflect this, and tends to reinforce this attitude that when you buy a place, you want to make sure that you can resell it and hopefully make a profit off it, or not hopefully, that you will make a profit off of it. And so any place that you buy, you have to think about, well, if I'm going to paint this room pink, is that going to actually hurt my potential return on my investment? So at that point, a residence doesn't become a place that you shape to make yourself comfortable and make it comfortable for you and reflect your personality. In fact, in many ways, maybe you don't want it to reflect your personality, because that might very well impact the resale value to someone else, because obviously they won't have the same taste and same personality you do. So the idea that the minute that you buy a place with the idea that you're going to be transiting out of it, or that it's an investment, the whole concept of curb appeal, for example, really changes the way that you look at it. And at that point, I would argue at that point, it's not a home anymore. At that point, it's a house, because you're seen as a temporary thing that's basically, and it's an investment, which means you plan to make profit off of it. And that's going to define everything from how you do the lawn, to the type of plants that you plant, to the colors that you paint it, to how you do the interior, interior furnishings, and most especially if you renovate or change the interior. So this has huge implications in people's sense of permanence in terms of an emotional, social permanence attached to the place they live in. The minute that you change the concept of home as a place where I raise a family, to home, the house as an investment, among other things, you make life very temporary, because then your perception of your house is based on how much its cash value is. And if the price of home starts to collapse, then all of a sudden you're in a panic because you can't get your money back on your house. Never mind whether it's a comfortable house to live in. The idea that you have to be able to resell it is become a really huge view in the way that people see this. And of course, you also see it here in the fact that many of the homes here, especially in upscale neighborhoods, are actually bought by people that don't live here at all anyways. They're only residents in that particular location for maybe 6 to 10 weeks of the year. It's certain to a country Maui like Kula, or a huge percentage of the homes are second or third homes for folks from the mainland, or largely from the mainland, who buy them both as investments, but also as one of a sort of an investment opportunity, since it's multiple pieces of real estate are actually a safer investment than the stock market, for example. So at that point, they're not going to look at a house in terms of whether it's comfortable. They're not going to look at a house and whether it's, oh yeah, the kids will have a good time in the backyard. I mean, that might be part of what they're looking at, but the major part of what they're looking at is I've got $1.5 million, so I'm going to buy this property in Lanai, because I'm pretty sure that I can make money off of it. And in the meantime, I can live in it, in the winters, for example, and then live in my home in Aspen or Denver in the summer. And I've got this as an investment. So it's a way to basically move your financial capital around. And at that point, of course, it's not a residence. Your relationship with neighbors, everything is really transient, because it's now it's a form of commodity. And in fact, the commoditization takes over from the actual function of the place. One of the other things that you see that's really sort of striking about this, and this is again a change that I think makes Hawaii different than the mainland in many ways, and actually much more like Asia, which is something that we don't think about too much, but certainly is very much here, is the fact that when you look at the idea of residence, residence on an island that's only about 30 by 50 miles is never going to be the same as the state of Oregon or the state of Idaho or Colorado or whatever. You don't have that luxury of being able to expand almost infinitely horizontally across the landscape and build another 3 subdivisions, like you see in the area around Portland, Oregon. What you're going to have to do is at some point you have to find other ways to do this. Now, at some point you can try to build horizontally, and that would be Kapolei and Ewa and Waipio, Gentry, and all the rest of this. And there's huge discussions about this when you bring in the concept of agricultural or food sustainability and subdivisions. They're mutually antithetical. And so when you look at this, what you find is the alternative, which we don't tend to discuss very much here in Hawaii, but certainly makes us radically different than the mainland. Here, what you see is, especially out here on Oahu, is the need to pack as many people as possible into very, very limited real estate. You just literally do not have the square meters to move horizontally. Is that you do it this way? You move it vertically. Kaka'ako is a fascinating example of this, in that not only is Kaka'ako a perfect example of the verticality, but also that you find a lot of the idea of investment, whether it be, in fact, I think in this particular structure here, I think almost a quarter of the folks that live in there, this is actually a second or third residence, many of them from Asia. So what you find is whereas in the mainland, folks would invest generally in a house, even if it's second, third residence, but also as a residence in general. What you find here in Hawaii, it's especially on Oahu, and especially Kaka'ako was the quintessential example, is more and more as you're finding this verticality becomes this. So what you do, and there's, as I'm sure you've heard in other classes, that there's an enormous advantage environmentally from this. There's a lot less footprint impact environmentally if you stack, I don't know what, 800 people in something like this, versus if you have 800, houses in a subdivision in, say, Kapolei. You're not only a lot less impact in terms of square meters of just foot space in terms of your actual floor plan, but also, from the area, whether it be sewage, water, everything else, it's a lot more compact. It's a lot easier to actually control environmental impacts in vertical structures like this. This makes us much more in common with what you see in Asia. And you have to remember that right now, if you look at this particular image, this is from 2-3 years ago. By, let's see, what is it? February. By, say, October this year, there will be at least 3, if not 4, new high-rises just in this image you see here. So this whole area of Kaka'ako is looking very much with an area I'm very familiar with, and that's Hong Kong. So let's take a look at sort of what I would argue is the view that Honolulu is moving to in many ways. And I think it's in some ways a healthier view than the idea of subdivisions, which really makes very little sense in a very, very small, very congested island. This is Tsim Sha Tsui in Kowloon side of Hong Kong. This is sort of the quintessential Hong Kong in many ways. It's very touristed in some ways, but also the key part here is a very complex, very Asian pattern of verticality. You see the same thing in Japanese cities, but Japanese cities, with a few exceptions, like say downtown Osaka, really aren't as squashed, because in many ways, Hong Kong's a really good parallel for Honolulu. It's a very, very small piece of real estate. It was politically distinct. So it pretty much didn't have anywhere to expand horizontally. So you went vertically. So you end up with basically the classic Asian, and also European logic of basically retail or stores or whatever you're doing commercially at the ground floor. And then your residence is on the floors above. In some cases, I think there's a restaurant here and some offices on this. But what you do is you pack everything vertically because you don't have the space to expand horizontally. And this makes for a very, very different dynamic in terms of how places look and also how people interact. And you see this classically in Hong Kong, which is in some ways sort of quintessential model for here. And it's an interesting model because when you look at this is Nathan Road. This is, some of the most expensive real estate in Hong Kong and actually in Asia. The stores along here. So this is your main shopping drag in Kowloon side. It's not as expensive as Central and Hong Kong side, but again, what you've got is you've got offices and various businesses here. Upper stories will be residences. So you've got this very, very dense mix. In fact, if you go about 3 blocks down here on this side, this is Mong Kok, which is actually the most densely populated place on the planet. I believe it's 10,000 people per block or something like that. It's an astonishing number. One of my favorite neighborhoods actually, but nonetheless, the key here is that what you have incredibly high urban density in an area that still actually functions very, very well. And that's simply because what you have is this idea of verticality, people's perception of the things that they do. People tend to do almost everything on the street in Hong Kong, as in urban Japan. You go to eat out, you visit friends in coffee shops or something like that. And very much almost like a Hawaiian style. If you live up, for example, in this building here, the actual home in the sense of your apartment is basically a place you go to basically fix something quick if you need a snack, and then maybe sit down and rest a little while in a very, very small living room that would be smaller than most dorm living areas. And then you crash in a bed. This is very true in urban Japan also, but you spend your life out on the street. So, and very much, what you might say is something actually closer in many ways, lifestyle wise, to what you see in traditional Hawaii with the idea of the social neighborhood being key and the residence or hale as being a sort of a rest stop. And it's easy to see in this context why you get like the Japanese concept of inside and outside. Outside becomes the minute you leave your apartment, you're in the world of everybody. You're in the world of your neighbors. You're in the world of the people that you hang out with. You're in the world of the restaurants that you go to, and places like Mong Kok or Sim Sha Sui, you very frequently go to the same. For example, we have breakfast at the same place every day, and then they know who you are, and in many cases they'll have your breakfast ready when they see you show up. So in some ways, the breakfast that you're getting is almost the equivalent of what you might do in a kitchen of your own, your own kitchen in, say, in the mainland. And so what you get is the life on the street isn't the same as, going to Main Street would be in classic Americana, where it's, something that's very separate from the residential private area. And this is in some ways, I think, the model that you see these two conflicting models in play here in Honolulu, especially. You have the dialogue of the single family residence, which, much as it's made noise about, and there's this huge demand that you have to do it. Realistically, it's a silly idea on an island, and its counterpart would be, well, if you can't do that, then you do this. And it's not by accident that Kakako, for example, was actually a social design by GGP, and one of the main factors of Kakako that makes it very much like its Hong Kong counterpart. There's very limited parking. There's very limited access to automobiles. And it's assumed that people will have access to all the services and things that they want to do when they get down to the ground floor of whatever the high-rise structure they're living in. So there's an attitude that you don't need to go anywhere else. And in some place like Hong Kong, here on Nathan Road, if you're living up here in San Mong Kok side, you might get on the superb subway system and go somewhere for very cheap, very quickly. But most of the time, you're going to be spending in maybe a 5 or 7 or 8 blocks, of your residence. And that's because everything you want to do and everyone you're going to hang around with is in that particular area. So you don't have to spend 2 hours commuting in from, Eva to Honolulu to Chaminade University or something like that. It doesn't, people would think that's nuts. So in that context, what you find is the way that people use space and the built environment is defined by other social structures and other perceptions of how social space works and how social, cultural landscapes operate and what the built environment's supposed to do. And even here on Nathan Road, one of the really interesting aspects of it is, on one hand, you have incredibly expensive real estate And Gucci and all the other high-end stores are down here, but you very likely will see a Gucci right next to a little mom and pop bakery where it's almost entirely local consumption and the tourists never see it. And that place survives perfectly well because of the local traffic that it supports. So the idea of sort of buying local is actually a huge part of Asian social design that you see in urban areas. And you see some of that, they're trying to do that in Kaka'ako, but I think one of the problems you get is that the American perception of how we use space and the function of built environment and our past landscapes really gets in the way of Americans investing in a Kaka'ako type lifestyle because they don't, Hong Kong and that type of urban life, whether it be Hong Kong, Tokyo, Osaka, whatever, Singapore, really isn't part of the mindset of Americans for a life that they would live. If they go there because they want to be in Hong Kong, that's one thing. But the idea that you would want Honolulu to be like Hong Kong, I think is something that's very hard for many folks to grasp because it's just not one of those models of past landscapes that we see as the goals that we have for ourselves. I think the last of these are very simple, and again, because they're thinking about the Hong Kong environment. Hong Kong is an incredible, well, still political shift, but Hong Kong was in many ways still is an incredibly attractive tourist environment, but it really doesn't offer anything to tourists in the sense of sort of, exotic fantasy stereotypes. It's Hong Kong. In contrast, when you think of the Hawaii image, is very much this idea of the tourism stereotype, which in many ways is, we've sort of bought into it if you're not part of the tourism industry. So we're here down in Waikiki, the classic tourism landscape of the 21st century for Hawaii. But if you think about it, I could have this image of the Wailea on Maui or the Waikoloa on the Big Island, and other than the fact that there'd be differences in the distance, you would have no way of figuring out which one it was. The landscaping would look exactly the same. And the interesting thing is, much of this landscaping looks the same even if you're not in Waikiki. The token use of native plants like the pohinahina, the naupaka, in this case, some tea. It reminds you it's a Hawaiian environment. The use of various types of imagery that again sort of parlay the idea that you're in Hawaii. So what you do is in many ways this image here is a modern interpretation of the Hawaiian landscape for tourism. Palm trees, many of which actually aren't Hawaiian palms, but actually Samoan palms. Other all exotic, for example, the chain trees, the shower trees, these are all, from Asia, Southeast Asia. So much of this landscape is it's obviously all artificial. This was all fish ponds, but it's also artificial in the sense it doesn't even reflect anything to do with Hawaii. There's no relationship between here and the traditional Hawaiian holly that you would have seen down in Waikiki, 200 years ago. This is a tourism-based landscape. It's enormous numbers of tourism stereotypes, just one on top of the other. And this is why it's satisfying to tourists, because it reinforces those stereotypes. And the more you get the stereotypes reinforced in the actual physical landscape, the more that people believe this to be an authentic landscape. So one of the ironies is you find that the more that you do this stuff in places like Hawaii, since this is the stereotypes that people have of what they expect to see, when you actually see it when they get there and they can actually touch that tree and they can smell the flowers and such, then that tends to reinforce this is a real landscape. It's authentic. So the word authenticity for tourism is very strange because authenticity in tourism isn't authenticity to the actual place. In other words, Hawaiian culture or even local culture. There's no carports in Waikiki, for example, and tourists wouldn't know what to do with a carport if you stuck them in it. But their idea of authentic is the fulfillment and the reinforcement of their stereotypes, or if you would, the validation of stereotypes. And that's what you see with the built environment here. Now, one of the surrealistic aspects of this is if you look at, areas that you're, going to, even whether it just be islands and in traffic lanes, or, for example, the entrance to Hawaii Lower Ridge. The landscaping that you see in much of the islands, especially here in Hawaii and Oahu, will be the same landscaping, because what happens is, to a certain extent, even folks that are from here tend to see this landscape as being the Hawaiian landscape. And so what happens is what was originally a tourism defined landscape now becomes much more generally accepted as the authentic Hawaiian landscape. Various types of palms and stuff like this. You can drive through even around campus, but especially you go down on Kahala, and you'll see exactly the same landscaping. You go into, say, 1 and 2 story homes versus hotels, but nonetheless, the landscape isn't any different. And that's actually one of the things that makes it Hawaii. So whether it be the way that you do the treatment on houses, whether it be the way that you do yards, tourism stereotypes have massively modified the way that we construct our built environment and on our expectations of the built environment. Of course, this also goes to interiors. One of the huge problems for interior designers here in Hawaii, especially in the 2020s, is how do you do an authentic Hawaiian interior? It's you don't use the same materials and fabrics and patterns that you used back in the 60s or 80s. But what is it today? And that's very hard to define. There's not really much agreement on it simply because it's not really clear anymore. The authenticity logic or stereotypes, if you would, pretty much are limited to outsides and the use of woods and natural, fabrics and such like that. But it's not really very coherent. And this is one reason why, if you look at interiors, whether it be high rises in Kaka'ako or homes in Kaimuki or something like that that are being renovated, you'll find that much of the interior will look very, very much like you would find anywhere in the United States or even, say, parts of Asia. So what you might call a sort of internationalized interior. And that's because, rather oddly, one of the fascinating things about tourism is it doesn't stereotype the interior of homes. Not here in Hawaii. It used to, but it really doesn't anymore. So for this class, one of the interesting things about the Hawaiian landscape is it's pretty much become a superficial or external landscape rather than internal. Now, if you think about it, in some ways, that's very, very similar to, say, Virginia City. Because if you think about that Virginia City world, it was very much an externalized world. The residences weren't even visible. They weren't even there. It was a very two-dimensional, think of the false front buildings. In some ways, you could argue that Waikiki is a classic example of sort of a modern version of the false front. It presents one face to the outside world, and there's very little interest in what's inside. And so I think when you're looking at Hawaiian landscapes, they're very much in a process of change right now. And I think in part because they're dealing with having to satisfy stereotypes from folks that are not from Hawaii, whether it be the mainland Asia or whatever, who have, in some cases, very divergent stereotypes of one, what they think Hawaii is, and two, what they also think, for example, what a home should be. What should a living area look like? How do you do this type of stuff? And if you're familiar with the local market here, one of the fascinating aspects has been the absolute collapse, for example, of Asian furniture stores. They don't exist anymore. They were hugely popular in the 80s and 90s. No one buys Chinese or Japanese furniture anymore here, even Chinese and Japanese folks that have moved over here. And that's really telling in some ways, because what they're doing is they're buying the same leather furniture and inspiration that's done to sort of Euro-American designs rather than what would be, say, comfortable home environment. And this is a huge dynamic change, probably tied to the internet and sort of global accessibility of themes and ideas and sort of look from places like Reddit, Instagram, whatever. But I've seen very little work done on this, and you don't see it really discussed much, at least especially in sort of interior design formats, in terms of what's happened to the uniqueness of regional or local interior design.